I'd also like to thank the Barr Foundation for a grant that helped us put this whole series on the history of open space together. And finally, I just wanted to thank some of the people who helped us plan this program. They include Keith Morgan, who will be our moderator this evening, Bree Harvey from Mount Auburn Cemetery, and Bill Clandaniel. Without them, we certainly wouldn't have been able to put together such an illustrious group of speakers. Keith Morgan will be moderating the program and will introduce the other guests. I have the pleasure of introducing Keith. Keith Morgan is a professor emeritus of American and European architecture at Boston University, where he taught from 1980 to 2015. He is a scholar of 19th and 20th century American and European architecture, with an interest in the relationship between architecture, urban planning, and landscape architecture. He has served as the director of Preservation Studies Program and of the American and New England Studies Program, and as the chairman of the Art History Department on 2 occasions. He is a former national president of the Society of Architectural Historians. His publications include Shaping a New American Landscape, The Art and Architecture of Charles A. Platt, Boston Architecture, 1975 to 1990, which he co-authored with Professor Noemi Miller, and Charles Eliot, Landscape Architect. He is the editor of one of the principal authors for Building of Massachusetts, Metropolitan Boston, and has served as the architectural editor of the Encyclopedia of New England, so certainly qualified to moderate our panel. So please join me in welcoming Keith Morgan.
Thank you, Gavin, for that generous introduction and for inviting me to participate as a moderator for this evening's discussion. As Gavin mentioned, we moved this evening from an earlier conversation that looked at the role of private sector and association-generated activity in preserving open space for the use of the public at large, to the role that governments and public authorities play at all levels, from the municipality to the federal government, in creating spaces that the Commonwealth enjoys. I hope that in the presentations by the 4 scholars on the stage, that we will begin to see important patterns in the work that we can assess as to how successful or not the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, its diverse cities and towns, and the federal government through its multiple agencies have been in saving and managing land for multiple purposes. Massachusetts is often seen as a leader in these enterprises, but we should be careful to examine both the successes and our limitations. Our speakers are all appropriately represent levels of government from the municipality to the federal state, and their spheres of interest will appear in their presentation. I'm proud to have known or worked with all of these people for many years. Beginning here on my left, your right, our first speaker this evening is Alan Banks, who oversees historical interpretation programs at the Frederick Law Homestead National Historic Site, Fairstead, in Brookline, where he has worked and conducted research over the past 27 years. His popular walking tours have been highlighted in the Boston Globe, and he has spoken widely at conferences across the country on the work of the Homestead firm. He's consulted on and appeared in several public television documentaries on Frederick Law Homestead and the public park movement, and has authored relevant articles and National Register nominations, including a recent comprehensive guide to the Boston park system. He'll begin our conversation primarily focusing on the municipal level. Alan Banks.
Thank you, Keith. And hopefully I'm told that can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, thank you. And again, I work at Frederick Law Homestead National Historic Site for the National Park Service. And I don't know if you've been to the site, it's basically right off of Route 9 behind the Brookline Reservoir. And I'm going to see if there we go. So there's Homestead. That's what he would have looked like when he moved to the site in 1883. This is 25 years after he designed Central Park. So when he moves to Brookline, he's already very well established. Not only designing Central Park, but Prospect Park in Brooklyn, along with other types of projects from the Capitol grounds to Riverside outside of Chicago, very early planned suburban community. I think the most important thing about the Homesteads and their connection to Massachusetts and their work is that they worked in Massachusetts. And as we're going to see, Massachusetts, they worked on somewhere along the lines of 1,200 projects in 150 cities and towns, and of those, about 350 relate to public land. So again, I think most people, when they think of Homestead, certainly when they think of them around here, they usually think, of course, of the Emerald Necklace, which is right outside our door here. And I'll talk just a little bit about that because it was such a seminal project and would affect not only the public lands of Massachusetts, but would have echoes all across the country, including the National Park Service. Why did Homestead move to Brookline? Again, the Emerald Necklace he was already involved with that, had already been working on the Arboretum, and he was also starting his work on the Back Bay Fens. But just like all real estate, the idea was location, location, location. So not only the location of his work, but also the location of people he had been collaborating on before he moved to Massachusetts. Again, I work at Fairstead, which is in the Green Hill neighborhood of Brookline, and two of his closest neighbors were also two of his closest collaborators. On the right, Charles Sprague Sargent, of course, the director of the Arnold Arboretum. He had been involved with the Arboretum almost from its inception. When Sargent raised the $3,000 he needed to have Homestead do some preliminary plans. And Henry Richardson, who was originally his neighbor on Staten Island, but when he moved to Brookline in 1874, when he got the commission for the Trinity Church, he had moved to Cottage Street where he could actually watch the construction going on because there weren't all those trees up there, literally from his front doorstep. So he was working with Richardson a lot in the Back Bay Fens, which we'll take a look at in a little bit, but also would work throughout Massachusetts with Richardson. Probably if you haven't been to northeastern Massachusetts, just south of Boston, you should make a trip down there because it's pretty incredible how much of that collaboration is in one small spot. Of course, the Emerald Necklace, and I'm not going to talk too much because I know I have a limited time, but I just do want to mention that this was, in some ways, Homestead's last hurrah, I think, to some extent. I think it was in the transition from the Homestead senior era to that of his sons. And if you read Homestead's writings, he gives his son John Charles especially co-credit for a lot of the work went on here. And I think that's what you find here also is Homestead working in collaboration with a lot of different people with a lot of different skills. So again, Homestead was not an engineer, but he worked with engineers from the city to help solve some of the issues of this very complex park system. Again, just mentioning Franklin Park, which was the classic Homestead Park, that large piece of land, that country in the city. The Arnold Arboretum, of course, a tree museum, a place for study, but also public space. And then from Jamaica Pond, I'm assuming most of you folks recognize the Emerald Necklace here? Shouldn't assume anything to that. From Jamaica Pond, pretty much down to the Charles River can be considered almost like one big water project. And I think that's what really makes this whole park system unique is that unlike Central Park, which was shoved into a grid, 840 acres of it, here he was dealing with different type of ecosystems. He was dealing with different municipalities. So he was really starting to look at landscapes broadly. Public land was starting to change as a definition. It wasn't just, again, that grid in New York. It was a system of different things that had to be dealt with in different ways. For Homestead, it was the work Back Bay Fens and the Muddy River that would be the most important work that they were doing. And so this was a project that was unique. Most cities put their water underground, and Homestead said you didn't have to do that as long as you took care to have it function in what its primary purpose. In this case, the genesis of the Emerald Necklace, as Sylvester Baxter described it, was sewage. It was a problem of how do you get sewage out of the city. So in the case of Richardson's collaboration, he designed the gatehouse, which is right back here, that helped regulate the flow of Stony Brook, intercepting sewers. And because of the fact that this was all water, pretty much, there wasn't much made land. You couldn't walk along on the fens, you could go over it. Of course, the Boylston Street Bridge. And I'll just tell you just a little bit about Homestead's reaction when he saw his friend Richardson's design. He said it would have suited the circumstances much better if it had not been so nice. Because, in fact, he described the Agassiz Bridge, which is another bridge, as looking like a partially standing ruin and the work of an unskilled mason. And he was paying it a compliment because if you know Homestead's design, it was always very rustic looking, and generally in the countryside of England, you don't find a very nice bridge like that. One of the things also, and I'm going to ask maybe our panelists, or if you give your opinion, oops, what happened there? This was a project that was now dealing with two municipalities trying to design and maintain one park. Brookline on the right, Boston on the left. And you can see some of the issues he was dealing with. Unfortunately, Charles Sprague Sargent was both a collaborator and could sometimes be a nemesis because he didn't feel that parks in America should have foreign varieties of plants, which is kind of ironic considering he was obviously the director of the Arboretum. But I think what you're seeing here is some of the larger issues that are going to come in play later on, where you have so many people involved in so many municipalities, in this case 2 separate different counties. How do you coordinate such an effort? Because with resource-based planning, there's no political borders, don't have anything to do with it. When the sewage comes down the line, just because it's coming to Brookline doesn't mean it still doesn't want to go. You got to coordinate how do you get rid of things like that. And this was actually even more so on a much larger scale. His protege, Charles Eliot, of course, who helped develop the Metropolitan Park System, and I love that exhibit out there, really was taking resource-based planning in terms of land planning on a much larger scale. And Eliot himself, again, had to deal with those issues of politics. And I find it absolutely amazing that he was able to put together a coalition that allowed us to have this metropolitan system. And I just wanted to point out, I was mentioning to a person, the Homesteads have a series of scrapbooks in their collection. We have a very large archives. And this is a scrapbook showing Charles Eliot leading through, I'm assuming the Blue Hills from where I found this, John Charles Olmsted. And I find it kind of ironic that here's Eliot so large and there's John Charles behind him. And the reason I've been able to find who these people are, like the cartoonist Zepp, he actually puts their names on their clothes. If you look very closely at Charles Eliot's leg, it says CE and JCO on that little guy behind him. He was a little guy. I just want to wrap up again. I touched very briefly on a lot of different things. Again, the seminal nature of the Back Bay Fens, but also the fact that Fairstead, when it was established not just as a business, but as a training center. So Olmsted brought in Eliot as an apprentice originally. He left and then came back as a partner. But Arthur Shorecliffe trained there, of course, the Esplanade, and worked throughout the Emerald Necklace. James Sturgis Pray helped found the city planning movement. And this is another cartoon, and I think this may be the last image of Olmsted. Now, obviously, it's not a photograph, because this came from a scrapbook from 1895, and it's showing Olmsted, and there are actually people's names on those flowers. And of course, what it's saying is he is growing the next generation. His son would establish the Charles Eliot Professorship at Harvard in 1900. So again, the impact on Massachusetts, just beyond the 1,200 projects, it was where really the profession started at Fairstead, and it morphed into something that we know today. So anyway, did I keep the 10 minutes?
Close on. A model citizen. Thank you. Thank you. Now we move from the municipal to the opposite extreme of the national schemes, engaging other things along the way. Dr. Ethan Carr, next to Alan, is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and professor of landscape architecture and director of the Masters of Landscape Architecture program at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He's a landscape historian and preservationist specializing in public landscapes. He's written 2 award-winning books, Wilderness by Design, 1998, and Mission 66, Modernism and the National Park Dilemma in 2007, that describe the 20th century history of planning and design in the U.S. National Park system as the context for considering future management. He was the volume editor of the early Boston years, 1882 to 1890, of the Papers of Frederick Olmsted that appeared in 2013. His book, The Greatest Beach, A History of Cape Cod National Seashore, is forthcoming in later this year. And as I said before, with Dr. Carr, we move to the national sphere. Ethan, thank you.
Thank you. I left this slide up because I wanted everyone to remember that it didn't look like that when it was the Harvard School of Landscape Architecture. That came a little later. Thank you, Alan and Keith. And I'm going to continue to talk about Olmsted a little bit, but only in the sense that I want to emphasize how important it was that he relocated to Massachusetts in the early 1880s. That had a lot of implications. Boston became the great laboratory. The Boston region became the great laboratory for Fairstead and for the development of the profession of landscape architecture during the most critical decade, really, in the 1880s. Not New York. And that's because he got fed up with New York and moved to Boston, and it's because, of course, the Boston Parks were also underway, which was another important reason to move. So there was a lot of implications having to do with the fact that a lot of professionals get trained at Fairstead and go on to do all sorts of things. And a lot of initiatives in landscape conservation are more or less the result, because a lot of those professionals are responsible for that and are forming organizations or being parts of organizations, nonprofit, what we would call nonprofit organizations. So Massachusetts, probably more than any other state, has this combination of institutions and professionals during this critical period at the end of the 19th century that lead to a lot of land conservation initiatives, many of which I'm sure this audience is familiar with. This statement that Olmsted makes also in 1893, I don't know if it's the same document as the one you quoted from, Alan, but it may be, is a remarkable statement. When you look at how he's talking about municipal parks, regional parks, it's all the same thing to Olmsted. It's all one great regional park project. There's no more graphic illustration of this than Charles Eliot and the Metropolitan Park Commission maps. Karl will be talking more about that, but this is just a graphic illustration of how there's this unity in thinking about public land at the municipal and the regional scale, and soon it will be national as well. Remember, Frederick Olmsted Jr. writes the legislation, key parts of the legislation that create the Park Service in 1916, but also the Bay Circuit idea, which is a concept that remains very important as far as park planning, open space planning, trail planning today in the Boston region. And it's a reminder that there are all these private organizations that have had such an important role. The trustees, Appalachian Mountain Club, Massachusetts Audubon, Spinnea. It's no longer called Spinnea, and I don't know what it's called. I think it's awful they changed their name, by the way. Spinnea was such a great name. But, and I'm leaving out some, and some of you may represent some of those organizations, so I apologize. But more than any other state, really, the role of professionals and the role of these organizations in advocacy and in land conservation project is very real. But I'd like to quickly sort of change gears and talk about the seashore specifically in this regard. Revere Beach is my transition here. It might be considered the first public beach when it becomes part of the Metropolitan Park System in 1895, or it might be considered a theme park, in which case it would have a slightly different history. But the seashore obviously is of a lot of interest to people. And perhaps more to the point is the case of the province lands. The earliest land conservation efforts in the New World really are on Cape Cod and the province land. It's been in public ownership since 1661, described as the province lands in 1727 when the Massachusetts General Court establishes province town. And from that point, it's been the subject of various efforts to prevent further wood cutting and grazing that were blamed for erosion. And erosion, of course, was silting in Provincetown Harbor, which was the source of all the income for the fishing fleet. That was what the state of Massachusetts, or the colony of Massachusetts, was actually interested in. So there were reasons why they wanted to enforce various kinds of conservation efforts, including planting beach grass, pines, bayberry, all of that stuff. And this continues through the 19th century. In 1854, the Massachusetts General Court again sort of reasserts ownership of the province lands and again mandates reclamation efforts. Again, it's mostly about trying to prevent erosion for economic reasons. But by that time, the province lands had been discovered, basically, by Henry David Thoreau in particular, who was really the most important early tourist to Cape Cod. So he's doing lectures, he's writing essays. There's the 1865 compilation of his essays that's published posthumously that we see here. And so the Cape Cod, the Great Beach, the Bayside, the province lands are being seen in new ways by someone like Thoreau, which is a really important fact, I think, when it comes to seaside land conservation. He saw the Cape and the province lands essentially as a modern tourist would. In other words, he's not someone who's in the land, working in the land and fishing and so on. He's having an experience of the land. And the railroad opens the year before he starts traveling to the Cape, which has something to do with all of this, obviously. And it's still remote, Cape Cod, and it doesn't become a resort in the 19th century, but of course it does very quickly in the 20th century as soon as people start to have automobiles. Jim O'Connell is here, and he can tell us about that if people have a question. Where are you, Jim? For those of you who are familiar with Jim O'Connell's book on Cape Cod. So anyway, not much happened on the Cape in this regard until the trustees were formed in 1891. And if you read the first annual reports of the trustees of reservations, trustees of public reservations, that is, they are mostly about the seashore. And they're especially concerned with the seashore. They commissioned Jonathan B. Harrison, some of you may know who that is, to compile a report on seashore reservations and accessibility in the state. And he added his own addendum specifically about the province lands, which was a subject of fascination for him. But of the 46 towns he surveys, none of them have adequate beaches, public beaches at that point, and private development is rapidly closing off what access there is. It's followed by an 1893 report by Charles Eliot. And Charles Eliot mapped and did other things, but also pointed out that actually people are really using the beaches quite a bit on Cape Cod. It's just they're using their right of common access and common land that no one was quite sure who owned. And that starts to get remedied by the end of the century. By the 1920s, town beaches, which are really important for tourism and real estate, were being established. So anyway, to make a long story short, the unique legislation that creates the Cape Cod National Seashore in 1961 can be seen as having a lot of its origins, going back to the tradition of advocacy, nonprofit organizations, and professionals in Massachusetts. And it was this regional context, this history of advocates and organizations that shaped a new kind of national park legislation in the 1950s, which changed how large-scale landscape conservation would be done thereafter in the United States. You know, national park historians talk about before 1961 and after 1961. And what they're talking about is the Cape Cod legislation. And this is the subject of a book that will come out later this year that I've just completed for the National Park Service. In part, this is a very familiar story. Everybody knows about JFK and Hyannisport and the fact that he introduces the legislation and then he signs it as president in August of 1961. But in part, it's also a less known story, and that's for our own purposes this evening for discussion, and that is how the social and environmental and political context and the history of land conservation in the state, going back, in fact, to the 17th century, shaped this unique turning point in national park history, the Cape Cod Model, or the Cape Cod System, as it's known, in which private property owners were allowed to continue to live within park boundaries. Does everyone know what the Cape Cod Model is? All those incredibly influential people who owned vacation homes on Cape Cod did not have to leave. They got to keep their property subject to local zone approval of local zoning controls. So that's another, and then of course the park gets developed. I shouldn't have left out Leverett Saltonstall, who was obviously the other senator. Got him somewhere. I guess I already left him out. But back to, okay. But obviously this is another longer story about Cape Cod, the development of Cape Cod. Does anyone remember Coast Guard Beach bathhouse, which of course the nor'easter of 1978 did away with? They were discovering things about erosion as they went along, and this is a lot to discuss. Ideas like, was the Cape Cod Model a success or not? You know, if you go to Cape Cod today, you consider that 1961 legislation a good thing or not. Who really shaped that legislation? You know, it wasn't the Park Service. I mean, they were along for the ride, but they were not the key shapers of that legislation. What was the role of prominent and influential people on the Cape, the role of conservation organizations, the role of professionals in the state, and so on? But this is all for discussion. And it's worth noting, though, finally, that the history of conservation in Massachusetts, as well as a very engaged generation of Cape Codders, managed to create a new kind of national park. And it's one of the most important moments in the history of land conservation in the state. Even though it's a national park, it's really a lot about how that legislation got shaped by being in Massachusetts and sort of the regional historical context. Because really, as I said, national parks would not be created the same way again after Cape Cod in the United States. It's a turning point. You know, from then on, the National Park Service has got to deal with people who live there. They're not going to simply evict them and bulldoze their houses.
I've browbeaten all the speakers to stay on schedule, and they're doing a beautiful job, so thank you. And obviously I tried to box Ethan inappropriately only into the federal zone, and all of these boundaries are very fluid, and that's something open for conversation later. Next, Dr. Carl Haglund serves as the Senior Planner and Project Manager for the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. For 30 years, Karl has directed major projects in urban and regional open space planning, public arts, and the design and interpretation of historic structures and public spaces. His book, Inventing the Charles River, was published by MIT Press and received an honor award from the American Society of Landscape Architects. He's been the project manager for the new Charles River Basin for the last 25 years. This $100 million project is nearly complete and will create 40 acres of new public open space here in the heart of the metropolis. Since 2003, he's been a member of the Planning Committee for the Environmental History Seminar Series here at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and he served nobly for 19 years as a member and chair of the Town of Belmont Planning Board. Carl Haglund.
One of the great ironies of Google Maps is that it is destroying our ability to read maps. And I think, as Ethan has pointed out, the map of this map is a photograph from the 1893 first report of the Metropolitan Park Commission. And those back then, people who could read maps could see very clearly the scheme that Eliot and Sylvester Baxter were proposing, which, as complicated as that map is, can be boiled down to the rock hills, the stream banks, and the bay and seashores. The rock hills starting at the Middlesex Fells at the top. I should back up, if I can. Back up, there we go. The rock hills, the Middlesex Fells, the Silver Building on 128, the backside of Waltham, and the Great Blue Hill, which circumscribe the park system. And then the park system was to take as much as they could of every river and stream. So we have the Mystic River, the Charles River, and the Neponset River and their tributaries, and then we have the bay and seashores. And for most of us, we have touched one or more of those areas of open space that were set aside beginning in 1893. And I should mention briefly, that was in the middle of a recession when Charles Eliot persuaded the legislature to spend $2 million on starting the park system. The Adams family was in such bad straits, they had to telegraph Henry in Switzerland to come home and bring his credit line with him. It was not an easy time. And in that report, they used every graphic means that were available to them. They did a beautiful series of hand-drawn drawings of these parks, proposed parks. They did maps that compared Boston with Paris and England and so on. Then they did photographs. Who were these two people, and what do we know about them? The first report was written, the first part of the report, the first 80 pages, was written by Sylvester Baxter, and Charles Eliot, no middle name or initial, wrote the 30-odd pages of the second part. These two founders could not have been more different. It is much easier to get a sense of Charles Eliot thanks to the collection of writings, of his writings, extensively annotated by his father, a 10-pound book that was recently reissued under the editorship of Keith Morgan. Charles W. Eliot had been president of Harvard University for 10 years when his son entered college, and he served as president for another 30 years. The son had recurring episodes of anxiety and depression, and in his unpublished autobiography, he wrote that as an upperclassman, he, quote, could find no practical bent or ambition anywhere about me. In his senior year, he considered giving up his studies. His uncle, the architect Robert Peabody, lived in Brookline near Frederick Law Olmsted, and Peabody persuaded Charles that he should become a landscape architect. A year later, Peabody introduced Charles to Olmsted, who immediately offered Charles an apprenticeship. In 1885, Charles followed Homestead's advice and traveled to Europe for 11 months. Sylvester Baxter was born in Falmouth, the 9th child in a family of 13 children. In his unpublished autobiography, he wrote in the third person that, quote, he had a thirst for learning and desired to enter the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to study architecture. But, he wrote, the means were not available. He worked in a print shop for 2 years, picking up knowledge, he said, by means of books, and continued the musical instruction of his boyhood by a term of piano study at the recently created New England Conservatory. He began writing a few stray items for the Boston Traveler and then was offered a full-time position at the Boston Daily Advertiser. Then he wrote, feeling the need for further study and of a wider experience at the world at large, Baxter went to Germany to study what the Germans called municipal administration, what we would now call city planning. He also went to a number of concerts, including the first cycle of performances of the Ring of the Nibelungen. Returning to Boston, he wrote several books of poetry, wrote for the Boston Herald, supporting a campaign to preserve the woods around Spot Pond, and joined several archaeological expeditions and colonial architecture in Mexico. In 1890, he published a series of articles about what he called Greater Boston. It may have been the first use of the word greater in front of a city name. He called it a federalized metropolis comprising the city of Boston and surrounding towns. One of the features of Baxter's Greater Boston was a metropolitan park system. According to Baxter's autobiography, Charles Eliot was so impressed with the suggestion as to parks that the two started an organized effort backed by influential support to carry the idea into effect. And in that first report, we have the only joint piece of writing. Keith Morgan and several other people, as well as myself, have hunted in vain for any kind of personal connection between these two men, but somehow they worked together for over a year in founding the park system. For decades, Baxter was forgotten by almost everyone. Then Cynthia Zaitsevsky, in her study of Homestead and the Boston park system, acknowledged his role in the founding of the metropolitan park system. Poignantly, in one of his last books of poetry, Baxter wrote, "What matter, though they never know of me? O city of my love, I tell thee now, it is enough for me that I shall know." And when we see a new riverfront green space here, this photograph that you're looking at is on the edge of the Mystic River, just in from Route 28, crossing the Mystic. We see finally a park gets named for Sylvester Baxter, and his efforts are ultimately finally acknowledged. So what did Eliot and Baxter have in common? They walked a lot. They hiked a lot. They looked hard and carefully, and they wrote a lot about urban and rural landscapes. What can we do to improve the public landscapes of Boston and Massachusetts? Walk more. Look more carefully. Ask more questions about our stewardship of our shared public realm. Then, when an essay appears this month in, say, Harvard Magazine about, say, a project on public land like, say, the Neponset River Greenway, we might surmise that this is not just an effort of volunteers. Then we might find that a project of this extent is an effort of several decades by conscientious, publicly employed planners and landscape architects, creating a modest but significant public space in our behalf.
Having long been a student and advocate of Charles Eliot myself, 3 people in the cocktail hour asked whether we would hear about Eliot tonight, and I promised to, but so far we're batting 100, and I know that Eliot will come back on the stage in the 4th presentation as well. Sean Fisher, our last panelist, serves as the archivist and historian for the Department of Conservation and Recreation, a state agency that supervises forestry, parks and restorations, historic sites, recreation facilities, parkways, and flood control projects statewide. He manages an archive of 5,000 or more boxes and oversized materials representing DCR and more than 30 other predecessor organizations, some of which we've been hearing about, dating all the way back to the 1870s. I can attest that the archives he oversees are well organized and a pleasure to use, even though I used them in the period of his predecessor, the famous Captain Swanson, and not Sean's period of oversight. He's compiled a guide to the related archival collections outside of the DCR archives, a guide to the stewardship of archival collections, and wrote the best management practices guide for the records typically found in Massachusetts state park offices. We've saved the perhaps least well-known part of our story for last, and I'm delighted to have Sean fill us in on material we need to know.
Thank you. In Western Massachusetts, another movement was afoot, partly through the efforts of John Bascom and Francis Rockwell, as they petitioned the Commonwealth to acquire Mount Greylock. The legislation that creates the Greylock Reservation Commission in 1898, as well as 6 of the other 7 county reservation commissions, specifically states, quote, "The commission shall have the same powers in acquiring land for state reservation, which are given to the Metropolitan Park Commission, and shall be vested with full power and authority to care for, protect, and maintain the same on behalf of the Commonwealth." At the time of their establishment between 1898 and 1922, the 8 county state reservations are owned by the Commonwealth, but managed by commissions under the county commissioners' structure of government. Another key player in the early history of the Massachusetts state forest system is Harold Parker. He was a founding public servant and chairman of both the County Wachusett State Reservation Commission in 1899 and of the State Forest Commission in 1914. He was also a member of the Commonwealth's Special Commission on Taxation of Forest Lands in 1913-14. He died in 1916. Like Sylvester Baxter, Bascom and Rockwell did not leave behind a collection of papers regarding their open space advocacy. The writings in published form are what survive, and Parker, too, has no surviving collections of papers. Alfred Ackerman was our first state forester, a professional forester who served for 2 years. His 1906 Forestry in Massachusetts pamphlet is a fascinating read, and I quote here as an example. "The Commonwealth ought to extend its policy of park reservation to include genuine state," and he capitalizes the word state, "forests. The reservations that have been made so far are distinctly for park purposes," end quote. He is obviously referring to the metropolitan parks. Ackerman's vision was fulfilled through our second state forester, Frank W. Rand. Our first state forest is Otter River State Forest in 1915, and in quick succession, some of the state's largest state forests were acquired: Miles Standish and Howard Parker in 1916, Savoy Mountain in 1917, and the smaller Swan State Forest in 1918. The first state public ocean beach, Outside of the metropolitan Boston is Salisbury Beach State Reservation in 1933. The waterways engineering function of the Massachusetts Department of Public Works created its first state public ocean beach in Provincetown, opened in 1953 on the lands of the Province lands. In that same year, the legislature authorized this state agency to take over Salisbury Beach State Reservation from the State Forest and Parks Agency and to create other state public ocean beaches. The first, under that legislation, is Scusset Beach, which opened in 1957. Our first state parks, using that phrase, state parks, are Nickerson and Robinson, both gifts to the Commonwealth in 1934. By 1941, the bulk of the state forests and all 8 county state reservations have been acquired. One of my favorite documents in the archives at DCR is the 1963 Department of the Interior Directory of State Recreation Agencies. State Forests and Parks, DPW Waterways, and all 8 county state reservation commissions are all listed. Every one of these forms today's DCR. The 8 county state reservations were transferred to State Forests and Parks under 3 different periods: 1967, 1975, and 1990. The waterways, state ocean beaches, were transferred in 1968, and its Pilgrim Memorial State Park, or as everyone would know it, Pilgrim Rock, was not transferred to State Forests and Parks until 1983, having been managed by DPW Waterways since 1924. The management and staff of the Metropolitan Park Commission and the MDC were dominated by professional engineers and police, with landscape architecture provided by Charles Eliot, the Olmsted brothers, and by Arthur Shercliffe and his son Sidney. In fact, the functional divisional name selected in December of 1919 for the new MDC says it all: Parks Engineering. On the other hand, the management and staff of the State Forest and Park System was dominated by professional foresters. And it was not until the input of the Civilian Conservation Corps during the 1930s that landscape architecture, building architecture, and engineering became to influence the system. My point is that the pedestal that historians place on the Metropolitan Park System is mainly through the vision and work of its landscape architecture consultants, rather than through the actual internal work of the state agency itself. In my more than 25 years of managing the archives of the Metropolitan Park System as a state agency and state system, no historian has ever requested to review the surviving internal documentation of the MPC and MDC to write a history of this park system. For the statewide system, the late agency staff forester Bill Rivers' history of that system in the 1998 Stepping Back to Look Forward book is a good start. At that time, there was no centralized archives of the Massachusetts State Forest and Park System, though he did accumulate some key collections. It is my own comprehensive and archives records management surveys at each regional, field, and park office in that legacy system between 2006 and 2013 that such a collection has been amassed. The red dots on this map indicate every park office I visited. In fact, there was approximately about 100 offices through those years. Our own state archives in Massachusetts, the final permanent repository for archival records of executive branch agencies, has actively collected MDC records since 1980, without collecting virtually anything of the statewide system. During the forthcoming 10 years, this will dramatically change, beginning in 2019, when the State Archives opens its new Archives Vault edition, which is currently under construction. DCR and many other state agencies can renew large transfers of archival record series at that time. From the DCR archives, this will include archival records of the 3 metropolitan systems, parks, waterworks, and sewage works, of the state forests and parks, of the county state reservations, and of the waterways engineering function. Unlike other state agencies, having a professional archivist on staff will result in having record series archivally processed and described, and in many cases archivally rehoused before their transfer. The work of the DCR archives is creating a more balanced collection strategy of the archival record of the Commonwealth's state-owned and managed public open spaces. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. I learned a great deal from that, and I'm grateful for the new work it represents. I want to start out with a few basic questions, and then we'll open the floor to everyone. Despite my impeccable Boston accent, nurtured over the last 40 years, I actually grew up in Ohio. So that coming to this topic as a non-native, I think of state parks as a totally different world than what the complexity and layered experiences of this evening and how it connects to the previous conversation and the one that will be the final stop in this 3-part series represents. We've seen a whole range of different types of parks with designated and bifurcated purposes. So let me begin by asking the panelists, to what extent have municipal, state, regional, and federal programs managed to effectively integrate with each other in the preservation of open space? Or has that become a contentious, or has it often been a contentious and divisive part of the story of land management in Massachusetts?
I can start with that because, of course, the basis of Cape Cod National Seashore. The entire legislation depends on cooperation between municipalities and the federal government in the approval of zoning, local zoning codes. And that's the basis for leaving private residences within the seashore. And that's been contentious for 50 years. And only recently have all the zoning codes been brought to a condition that the Park Service is now happy with them completely. And so there is a kind of a completion of that park that's taken place 50 years after its creation. But that kind of cooperation with state as well, because of all the things like wetland regulation, Nickerson State Park, and everything else. So it's the basis for whether or not that park could work. So and it's been contentious for a long time, but it's very much how the model works.
Another piece of that is the role of federal regulation. The Rose Kennedy Greenway and the parks at Nashua Street and North Point and Paul Revere Park in Charlestown do not come from the largesse of the federal government. We benefited from the fact that in the reform era that gave us the Department of the Environmental Protection, the transportation legislation was passed that said if a federal transportation project took land from an archaeological site, a natural site, a public park, there may be a couple of other categories in the legislation. If a transportation project went through a park, federal government had to make up for it. And that regulation went to the Supreme Court in a case called Overton versus the United States, where an interstate was to go through the middle of a park in the middle of Nashville. And that's what funded the Rose Kennedy Greenway and the parks between the Museum of Science and the North Washington Street Bridge, and created the opening for us to do fun things like privately raise money for a skate park, which probably has more people per hour per square foot than any other park that we have in the system.
Alan, Sean, and then Alan.
during the 1980s and into the 2000s, the statewide system was providing municipalities through the Homestead Grant Program, and Homestead Landscape Preservation Program, and other landscape preservation programs, monies to municipalities, cities, and towns in Massachusetts to preserve town commons and historic cemeteries and other historic landscapes. So the statewide system was very much providing a funding source through the state legislature, various preservation component.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention, and perhaps Ethan, you could maybe add to this, that Lowell National Historical Park was a very new model for a national park in the 1980s, where you see the partnership between the city, obviously the federal government with Lowell itself, but also with UMass Lowell and the Songa Center for this education, really cutting-edge educational type of research going on, and obviously execution. So that's more on an urban scale.
You want to know how important all that investment was? Compare Lowell to Lawrence. In one day, you can do both. You can see what a few gazillion federal dollars can do for a town.
Let me ask one other question before opening it to the audience, and that is that Boston and Massachusetts at large is justly understood as one of the most important centers of education in the United States. So what has been the role of professionalism and educational institutions on the whole range of activities that are represented by the municipal, regional, national, and statewide programs that you've been discussing? Can you just characterize how professionalism...
Positive or negative?
Either way. I like a fight, so keep going.
Obviously, I was alluding to some of the positive things. You know, Boston is also a city that's sort of invested with architects, and that hasn't always been a good thing.
And I would second that for landscape architects. The Department of Conservation and Recreation has been able to draw on a wide range from many large and small firms when we do our best work.
And I think in terms of the Homestead firm itself, obviously, we talk about the 6 degrees of Homestead, that almost anybody who's in the profession of landscape architecture can trace their lineage back to Fairstead. And a lot of the people who were training there at Fairstead would stay local. You know, again, people like Arthur Shercliffe, Herbert Kellaway, did Marymount Park down in Quincy. So again, I guess that role too, hopefully all positive in that sense. Because they work at the Homestead site, that way have to be positive.
When I was referring to professional foresters, many of our early foresters were graduates of the UMass Agricultural College or Yale or Cornell forestry schools. And when I was interviewing state forest park supervisors in the 2000s for my record survey, a fair number of them were graduates of the Stockbridge School of Agriculture as part of the UMass system.
What we haven't heard anything is about the women. So to what extent are women playing a role in any of the examples or the professional life that you've been talking about?
Alan can't answer this one because the Olmsted firm refused to hire women.
Well, they had women, but I will say probably one of the most important women in landscape architecture history, at least certainly in terms of studying, was Theodore Kimball Hubbard, who was married to Henry Hubbard, who worked for the Olmsted firm, and they developed what they call the NABNAC system, which is, if you're on the stacks down at the Lowell Library, I see some people laughing. That's the system that was used to, again, track landscape architectural records, which I think is probably important.
Theodore Kimball is really important because she's the co-author of the first major textbook on landscape architecture. Also, she's not working with the Olmsted firm, however, she was married to someone who did. Yeah.
I would say in the recent past that almost every firm that we have worked with at DCR in designing parks has had co-educational partnerships in almost every firm. We have worked with principals and licensed landscape architects who have come out of often the Massachusetts programs in landscape architecture and liked it here so much that they have stayed.
Okay, can we open the discussion to the floor, and anyone who would like to have a question? There's a microphone that's available. If you have trouble getting to the microphone, I'd be glad to, or Gavin would be glad to bring it to you. What questions do you have?
I have a question for Sean.
Please, totally fair game. Gives the audience more time to think.
state parks in Massachusetts, do you think that to some degree in the 20s and 30s, they didn't progress as quickly as other states in the Union? There were, because that was a really rich period for state park development, because already so much had been done by trustees and by other private organizations in the state. And then at Cape Cod, of course, they were already anticipating that there would be a national park there. But it seems that in Massachusetts, state park development didn't reach the same levels that it did. It wasn't as, we weren't getting as much money from the federal government in the 20s and 30s, especially the 30s.
Unfortunately, I really don't have an answer for that. Yeah, it is a good question, and I'm not familiar with comparisons to other states and where we rank as far as designating something from a state park versus a state forest.
State forest was a different story. They were doing pretty well with state forest.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't answer.
State parks not so well compared to other states.
Can I just make one comment before she leaves the room? In addition to the conversation tonight, if you haven't had an opportunity to see the wonderful exhibition that's now in the Leventhal Map Center that has been organized by Dory Klein, the curator, who's just disappearing out the door. It's called Breathing Space. A lot of wonderful material. I congratulate her, encourage you all to see it. And now you can.
Actually, Ethan, I'd like to make one additional comment, and that is, after World War II, in the beginning of the 1950s, there's just this huge wave in Massachusetts state park development.
Yeah, after World War II.
After World War II, right. It doesn't happen until after the war.